Hey guys, thanks for joining Watercolor Landscape. So I'm going to give you the tutorial for our main project today, which is a landscape inspired by the Romantic artist Thomas Mostyn. He was a Georgian artist who specialized in sort of fantasy garden scenes. And we're going to be using a wet on wet technique, then allowing our paper to dry a bit, and then doing wet on dry paper while also using some of the card techniques we've learned in class, possibly a little bit of the sponge technique, and if you're brave enough, the addition of gouache, and we'll actually be making gouache out of our Anna Linky watercolors. So to start with, I've got some little pieces of board. I've got a rough brush for my gouache and for dry brushing, which we'll go over. And I've also got my watercolor brush somewhere. Okay, here's my watercolor brush. And you might want to use a spare sheet of paper or the sheet of paper that you've done your earlier exercises on as a straight edge. But we're going to start by looking at our reference and dividing our page up. Roughly, the design of these landscapes is going to follow the rule of thirds. So we'll just make a third here, third here. It's not exact, but you'll see in Mostyn's work a lot of elements of the rule of thirds. You want to make these marks as lightly as possible. And these are just going to help me guide where I place the different features in the work. Although you're encouraged to kind of do your own interpretation of the work, you don't have to copy it exactly, nor should you, in fact, because part of this wet on wet technique and part of working in watercolors is learning to work quickly enough so that the paper doesn't really cauliflower. And in order to do that, you need to just relax a little bit, loosen up, and allow the paints to have a little bit of freedom across the page. So I'm wetting down the page. You might want to do this with a wet paper towel, but I'm just going to get the page fully wet, and then I'm just going to wipe this off. It's actually, we want the page fairly wet for this first layer, so I'm just going to go back over it. Usually I would dab it up, but remembering this, we're actually going to be using a really loose technique. Then I'm going to mix together some of my watercolor. So I'm taking some green, and we're going to lower the chroma of the background, which, as you'll remember, can be done by adding complementary colors. So purple, green, and orange are all secondary colors that will mix together create brown. So they lower the chroma of the background, which makes it a little bit more realistic. So his works aren't entirely realistic, but still we're going to use dynamic colors to make it feel a little bit more natural. And I'm just going to now start the first wet on wet layer. So have fun with this, don't be too precise. And as I put down the different colors, they should be blending with one another to a certain extent. So let's come in with some of these purples. I'm not trying to do the details exactly that are in my reference. I'm just painting fuzzy generalities. So the way to think about this is if you had a camera that was out of focus. Sometimes you can kind of blur your eyes to see that. And we're just painting the background. I'm definitely not avoiding any of the shapes in the foreground. I'm just going straight over that and bringing the background down, which I know seems, wrong to a lot of you when you're used to kind of reserving white space for your watercolors or clear space, but trust me, we'll just be layering up, and these marks will be covered up by our later marks, so you don't need to worry too much about bringing the background down. But what it does, having an entire page full of paint, is it gives us something to work against. So it gives us a background to judge what other colors we should put in. And it'll also mean that there's a sense of continuity amongst our forms, which is something that we want. And then for the sky, I'm going to mix together a little bit of ultramarine, tiny bit of phthalo blue, and the tiniest bit of black, just to bring that chroma down so I don't have a glaringly blue sky distracting from the focus in the painting. So just bringing that down. And I'm just going to drop in a few more finer marks. So the idea of this kind of wet on wet, then wet on dry thing is actually as the paint dries, you can start to build in details that come closer and closer into focus as the paper dries, because they won't be sort of bleeding off to the side so much. So you can actually time your painting in a way that you're gradually moving towards further detail all on your own as the paper is drying and things are becoming more focused. So that's a cool thing that watercolors do, which just mimics exactly what we want to be doing on the page. I'm just going to get some orange across the lawn so we got some variation in light. Then gonna dab off in places. Putting my own spin on it here with more kind of darker layers at the base. And then if you want, you can also, for areas that are differentiated, as the paper is a little bit drier, I can come in here with the flat edge of the paper and come across so that I have a straight line in the background. And now I'm just going to let this dry. So in class, you'll just be allowing this to air dry, but I'm going to get a hair dryer so that I can do this now. Okay, so now that this is dry, I can start to move into the darker details. And for this, I'm going to use a card because there are a lot of linear shapes in my reference. You may find that yours has many linear shapes or not. But the second reason for using a card is that it forces me not to obsess too much, because I know there's a certain amount of unpredictability with it, and that can be a good thing. I'm going to make my very darkest value at this point, which is going to be kind of a reddish purple with just a bit of brown in it. So I'm running out of brown here, but you're going to want to mix brown, red, and purple together if you're doing this. And I'm going to put a bit of orange in here because I'm running out of brown, so that's just going to bring this to the level I want. I'm going to put a little bit of ultramarine. So this is a real mix, but the goal here is to make a really intense dark valued color without adding black. And now I've got my card and I can start to move in with the details, remembering large and general before small and complex. So let me just move this here. coating my card with this. I might have to do a couple of different dips, but I'm gonna try and get as much as I can on the card. And I'm gonna come in the foreground. All right, I need to get a lot more paint on here, so I'm just gonna mix up a little bit more paint. That is one of the challenges always with watercolors, just getting enough paint. And another thing I can do, which will just make this paint stick a little bit more to the card, is for the next one, I'm gonna just dip my card in water first. I'm just gonna help it get on here. All right. And I'm just making really like loose marks across the darker areas of the pond in the foreground. Adding more kind of variations on this really dark tone as I go along. So I'm going to add some greens to this purpley orange red as I move into the pond. It's hardly going to show up, but it'll add a little bit more intensity. I'm also going to get this little area of stairs in by dipping my card in water and then just making some marks going like this. And I'm going to come in for the darker areas of the trees, so. We want to think about what details we can generalize the most. So I'm just moving in with these darker areas. I'm going to add a little bit more water to this when I do the details a little bit further back, because as things move away, they get a little bit lighter. So let's get some of these trees. Add a little bit more orange as I move up the tree. And as I get closer to the lights coming from this side of the page, so I'm going to make these trunks more orange in color. And while I'm in this area, I'm going to take a little bit of paper and dip that into the orange purple mix to get some branches. Okay, and now I'm going to come back in with a slightly smaller brush to get some of those really vibrant greens that are showing up in the foreground. So I'm going to take some just plain green and drop this back into the pond. At this point, I can also come back in with a darker color to make any more precise details that need to be made. I'm going to get my card again, dip it in purple to get the base of some plants. I know this looks chaotic, but it will come together. I'm going to come in with my hogshead brush now, get more green on it. You want to, like, if you can, stick with one color. I'm going to move in with oranges and greens on these trees in the background. Oops. And another handy thing I can do with my card is just hold it here so that I have a precise base for my trees. And I can also come in and get slightly lighter green, this sort of muddy color, just a little bit of green on the trees in the background. Now, in a slightly diluted purple, I'm going to put together in one well an area that I can just dip once again my card into. Let's get this. To get some background. gonna get some darker colors on the side. So basically I'm trying to just simplify the values as much as I can and do as much as I can with the same brush and the same colors, just to simplify things. And at this point, I am ready to start mixing my gouache. So I want to start with that really nice, vibrant red for the flowers. So I'm going to really wash my brush off. While I mix it, I'm going to mix this with my kind of ratty brush. The hogshead brush, I mean, it has its purpose, but don't use the nice watercolor brush for this, just because it can ruin it. I'm going to mix together some kind of reddish tones in gouache. I've got this red color, and I'm also going to mix together a little bit of a lighter version of this color. With a little bit of orange added. And while I'm here, I might as well mix together all of them. I'm going to add a little bit of phthalo blue to this. To make a kind of gray violet. I want this to be kind of dark. I'll do this. And a little bit of purple also. And for this, I'm going to use my little piece of sponge, which let me find. Okay, so I've got my piece of sponge, and I am just going to start dabbing this color in. And again, I'm going to use that card technique to keep the color from going into the pond. So I'm going to mix together a little bit more of this color. So that red. Red. Now I'm going to come in with a bit of that kind of blue purple. Oops, that's way too much. I'm adding another bush here just because I like that. Now I'm going to quickly dry this before moving in with some more paler pastel greens. Okay, so now I've taken some of the jungle green mixed with the sap green and also some white, and I'm just dotting in little darker bits of leaves. And you'll notice that the color of gouache changes a little bit as it dries. That's normal, so sometimes you need to put a few layers on. I'm adding just some more focused dots. I'm making kind of brighter, more contrasty flowers as we get a little bit closer. And I'm going to make some dark green gouache. So just adding some green with my dirty brush. It has purple on it. Get a few more leaves. I'm just going to reinforce that, that line for the side of the pond one more time, and I'm going to do that in ultramarine blue. And now I can start to work on the stairs, so just really carefully, the gouache I have. Going to layer in the lighter values. And I can use pretty much just pure white for this because it's going to pick up on all of the colors underneath as it dries. Just making those contrasts a little bit more strong, just to really amp up the drama. And finally, I'm going to move back to the background with a little bit of white gouache that I've added some water to. So like a very light amount. To get some of these stairs in the background. My handy card once again to keep that at a straight line. For the trees, I'm going to add alternating bits of white gouache and orange watercolor. And get some of these warmer areas. add some reds as well. And then finally, I'm going to try and make this little dark figure in the foreground by mixing together some ultramarine blue and some violet and a bit of gouache. Tiny bit of orange also. I need to make them very, very tiny to really impress upon the viewer how big this landscape is. I made his head too big. Well, that'll do. Okay, and there you have it. You're almost in landscape in watercolor and gouache.